So I am Gene Frantz. I was told I had to introduce myself, so that's who I am. Uh, I have spent almost 40 years at Texas Instruments having fun. I've spent that career trying to create new businesses, trying to encourage others, and so this is a presentation that kind of looks back at my career and some of the challenges I had as an innovator. And so hopefully you can walk away having heard this talk with some encouragement on how to innovate. Now, if you'll notice, you all got this little card. One side says challenges for an innovator. The other side says something about challenges for managers of an innovator or something like that. And so there's two sides of this. An innovator cannot exist without somebody allowing that person to innovate. I have been fortunate in having a set of managers over the years who have allowed me to do what I do best, and that's innovate and create, and protected me from the problems that can occur when you're doing that. So let me get started with this, and I'm just going to tell stories. So I have several challenges that I think are important to think about. One of them is, or the first one is, I challenge you to think about the impossible, to take it on. And so let me give you a couple of stories that I've had over my career. The first opportunity I had to actually innovate was this thing called Speak and Spell. Most of you are too young to even know it existed. But it was a revolution in the world of signal processing and a revolution in the world of education. And we took it on as a small set of people in the consumer group at TI. And what was interesting is we had actually read some of the literature on the technical side, and most of the literature on the technical side said it was impossible to do a single chip speech synthesizer. And so from the technical community, it was known to be an impossible thing. We took it to the educational world, and there was this person that was the writer of probably half the textbooks in the United States on spelling. And we sat down with him and said, can you help us create a vocabulary for students preschool through third grade? Because that was our target. He spent a little bit of time explaining to us, first, students don't learn to spell till the third grade, and so no. Secondly, the display you're using is all capital letters, and so therefore you can't teach people to spell if all you're using is capital letters. And the example he gave me is, how will they learn to spell I? Well, that was the only one that was actually correct. So I got confused. And then he talked about how it didn't have a vocabulary because the way spelling was taught, I'm trying to get the words out and my spelling is going bad. The way the spelling was taught was not by rote memory, but by rules, and we were having this product which only worked with rote memory. And so what we heard from the educational expert was, educationally, this is the wrong thing to do. Don't do it. You're going to screw up a whole generation of kids. By the way, we had a problem with the voice and a few other pronunciation. There were several other areas that just hadn't been handled yet. Then we took it to parents. We did some focus groups with parents to see what were the thoughts of the people who were actually going to buy the product. And if you've ever tried to demonstrate a product that did not exist yet, you realize that you have to pick things that do exist to kind of give them a hint. And so we gave them or showed them a pull-string toy and a tape recorder, cassette tape recorder, if you remember that. And what they decided was, one, it would not be very reliable because pull-string toys broke easily. Two, it would be boring and educational because all you did was play this tape. And so what we heard from the technical experts, this is impossible. From the education expert, this is useless. And from the buying population, we wouldn't buy it anyway because it doesn't really work. Now, what would you do if those were your three inputs? What I did is I chose not to tell many of the people in the corporation that were going to fund us. This was not good information if you're making a funding decision. The reason for that is we, as the team starting it, had this gut feel that we could make this happen. It would be valuable to the educational market. And by the way, the educational expert did say something that we found interesting. He said, oh, by the way, there are these 250 words or so that the only way you can learn them is by rote memory. They don't follow rules. And those are the words that if you know how to spell, increase your IQ test scores. Well, duh. Why didn't he start with that? That's what we were looking for. We could put 250 words in there. And so we ended up taking that word list, creating a product that had all sorts of issues and difficulties. It wasn't just impossible to create a circuit. It was also impossible, or seemed impossible, to take it into production. And it fell out of production several times during its life, and so it was this continual thing. But we took it on, and so we were not afraid to take on this impossible thing in life. Let me see, I think I have another example. Let me make sure. Yeah, I do have another example of the impossible. About a decade ago, I had an individual come to TI from, his company was in Israel, and he had this neat new technology, and the neat new technology that he said he had was the ability to take a camera and point it at you and read your blood pressure, pulse rate, and even your glucose, just with a camera. And I'm always willing to listen to crazy people. And so we invited him in. We were in one of the conference rooms in Module D. And we were sitting there chatting as he was pulling stuff out of a bag and setting it up. And all of a sudden he said, well, Gene, your blood pressure is this and your pulse rate is this. And I looked over to his PC and I could see my pulse going across his PC. And I could see the different pieces of information of my vital signs on his PC. And I thought, this is pretty good. But I'm very familiar with most CEOs of small startups are really con artists. And so I said, here's what I want you to do. We're having a conference in 3 weeks. I want you to bring the technology. I will put you up in a suite on the top floor of the building, of the hotel. I will bring in the 25 or 30 TI employees for you to run a test on them. And by the way, I'm hiring an EMT to sit in another room and do the same test with classical technology. And I'm going to compare the two. Now, I didn't think he would show up. This was the con artist test. If he showed up, he wasn't a con artist. If he didn't show up, I knew he was. He showed up, ran the test, and I said, and by the way, I'll make sure all of our senior management are there so you can actually talk to the people who might be able to fund you. Well, that is now in production. It's being sold, I think they started out selling it in Asia, but it takes blood pressure, pulse rate, oxygenation, glucose, all of these things with a camera without interference of the human to get it done. Quite nice, but if you step back and say, let me think about that first moment, that was an impossible task. It was very easy to conclude that this cannot be done. And so those are examples of looking out and finding out what are the impossible things. The second thing is to solve the whole problem. Yeah, I have my cheat sheet over here because there's so many stories I could tell. I want to make sure I focus on the right ones. In the early 90s, answering machines was a brand new concept. Believe it or not, some of you are thinking, really? That we had time without answering machines? But we I was working with a small company called DSP Group, and between they and us, we were creating an answering machine to go to the market. Well, it just so happened at that time, the size of DRAMs, which were about 4 megabits, were perfect to store about 30 minutes worth of speech. And we also had a DRAM company inside of TI. And we went to them and asked them if they could sell us their bad DRAMs. Because we didn't need the DRAM to be good, because we knew how to fix it so it wouldn't be a problem. And what we heard from our DRAM company, that you ready for this? Most of you know the answer. We don't make bad DRAMs, right? And so we had trouble getting their attention. A couple things that finally got their attention. One was the CEO of the small company I was working with asked them if he could just get all the floor sweepings in a barrel, and he'd take the barrel and use them. The second thing is we wrote up a specification of the part we wanted, and they finally said, what we will do is we will take fallout of our burn-in devices we know have failed and send them to you just to show you that it can't be done. And so a couple of weeks later, I called back their manager and said, what happened to my bad parts? And he said, well, it was kind of funny, when we tested them with your test, they all passed. And so he couldn't find bad parts. Now, I'll throw an aside in there, because right now, as a company, we are looking at how can we get more profit out of our devices without raising prices. So let me give you a hint on how to do that. And it's what we did with the DRAM people. We said, what spec would I have to give you to get 100% yield? Unaware that we had done it, the spec we wrote for them virtually guaranteed 100% yield on DRAMs. And that began the new business called ARAMs, audio RAMs, and it allowed us to pursue this market. And the reason I say it solved the whole problem, when you have a $5 DSP running a $15 or $20 DRAM, it just doesn't seem reasonable. You need to get the price of the DRAM down so that you can solve the whole problem. And so this was that task of, my job was selling DRAMs, my job was designing, DSPs, my job was helping design in DSPs, yet the problem to get us into business was not a DSP, but a DRAM. And so it's that idea, how do we solve the whole problem? We are fortunate at TI because we have a wide range of products, from analog to microcontrollers to signal processors to multi-core devices. You name an aspect of our customers' need, and we have product. And it's our job to solve the whole problem, not just the problem in what we're doing today. And so that's a challenge I have, is look at the whole problem. Make sure you've solved it. Don't take no for a good answer. Now, I'll tell this story, and the manager I worked with is sitting on the front row, so I have to be careful how I tell it. When we were starting the MP3 business, that was a new area that we didn't think existed. In fact, if you go back in history, I think you'll find that TI was responsible for creating the first MP3 player back in the mid-90s. But we wanted to go do this MP3 player. And when we presented the business plan to the funders of our business unit, the managers, the response was, this is not a business big enough to worry about. Don't go after it. And rather than take that as a no, the person doing the work under me, I sat him down. I said, we need to make an org chart, and we need to paint everybody on the org chart who thinks MP3 is a good thing green. The people we don't know about, we don't know what their opinion is, yellow. And the people who think this is the wrong thing to do, red. And I want you to never talk to the reds. You can only talk to the greens. And we need to encourage the greens to convince the yellows to turn green. So that was the task. And so as we moved forward, we found out that MP3 was going to be a huge market. We had the opportunity of being the first vendor in supporting customers designing MP3s. And worked out very well, but if we had taken no for an answer, we'd have never been able to enter that business. And so there is this side that says, don't take no as that answer. Keep pushing on it. Now, there is another side to that, and I'm certain I can get a rebuttal out of any good manager that says, I can't afford to have 100 people working on something that may not succeed. We had 3. You know, there is this opportunity of keeping below the horizon of what's going on and moving it forward and seeing if you can get it solved. And so what we did is keep a small enough team that we were not creating a problem that required us to be shut down, but to move forward and make it happen. But we found an alternative to no, and that alternative was, let's do it anyway. And if you want to know who that manager was, I'm not going to tell you. I'll let Greg say who that was. I'm sorry, did I give that away? He'll probably talk later and explain the real story. I will admit that later on, after we were a success, the Wall Street Journal was out to talk to us about innovation. And so I told the editor what we had done with the red, yellow, and green. And he actually published that. And so it was kind of fun around here for a while. Which brings me to the next one of being patient. One of the businesses that was fun to start was DSP inside of TI. And once we had done this thing called Speak and Spell and we realized that there was an opportunity for signal processing, we as a company went off and began to design a general purpose digital signal processor. It was called the TMS 32010. And we introduced that in 1982, 30 years ago from last year, and began to market it. What we found is it was a wonderful device, but there weren't enough people in the world that knew how to design it in for us to make a business out of it. And if you have a good memory back to those days, you realize that we spent a lot of time working with universities to begin to teach signal processing, not at the graduate level, but the senior level, the junior level, the sophomore level. Now you can find high schools where DSP is taught. So we could expand the market of people who know how to do it. But even at that, that's a long process. If you think about bringing the education down into the undergraduate, it's still 5 or 10 years before it actually gets into the market and useful. We began to look and realize that when we put the top 10 customers for this last year and compared it to the top 10 customers of the previous year, there were no customers in common. We were finding every year a brand new set of top customers. And it took us, if you remember we introduced in 1982, it was the mid-90s before we actually had a viable business that we could look at and say, this is really going to drive the world. And so we had to patiently wait for 10 years or so for that market to catch up with the technology. And you look at that in a corporation where, in many cases, our long-term patience is 3 or 4 years. It took a lot of restraint on us from the CEO down to patiently wait. We know it's going to happen. We know it's going to be big. Let's wait for it to happen. And it did. And so that's another challenge is you need to be patient. Not always do things happen overnight, and we need to be ready to wait for them to happen and then take credit. I always love the take credit part. It's so much more fun than being accused of making a bad choice. So, another challenge, be global. I find it amazing sometimes that we as a Dallas-based corporation forget that our market is global. And that doesn't mean we sell to people in the US and it's manufactured elsewhere. That means the needs of every part of the world are different. And so let me talk about digital cell phones. The first time we as a management team in the DSP department heard about digital cell phones, it was because one of our European managers came over and presented it as a great opportunity that we needed to go after. Our conclusion was it really isn't that important. Why would anybody need digital cell phones? The US has plenty of space, and at that time, in the analog world, analog cell phone world, the US, Canada, and Mexico all use the same standard, so you just go wherever you wanted. What we didn't realize, because we were a US company, in Europe, every country, virtually every country had their own analog standard. And so when you crossed boundaries in Europe, you could no longer use your cell phone. And so there was this little effort going on in Europe called GSM to create this digital cell phone. But we didn't see a reason for doing that. And so what we chose to do is go ahead and work with our European team and allow them to begin to pursue it. Now, I think the first hint that it might be interesting was the original GSM spec. Every aspect of the technology was defined as to how many TI DSPs it took to do it. Now, that's your first hint you've been designed in. And so we pursued that, created the right products to go on. But that one came out of Europe, not out of the United States. You can find all the time that different parts of the globe are going to have a different demand, a different need. As we think global, we need to be looking for what is it over there that I can learn, take it into production, and bring it back to the other regions. Because with GSM, it started in Europe, and now the standards of cell phones are international. They're the same everywhere you go. And if you've done international traveling over the years, you know we went through very, very difficult periods where you were totally connected until you got on the plane, and then from then on you had no hope of being connected again. And so we can see the advantage of that 20 years ago of looking global and deciding that we would take advantage of what was going on in Europe. And by the way, the business manager for that became Jill DeFosse, who was the original manager that came over and told us, this is a great opportunity, let's go out after it. It was fun on that startup because in the US, the customer I had to go win was simple. It was just Motorola. They owned the wireless market. Jill didn't really have a big customer in Europe. Ericsson was there, but he picked up on this little company called Nokia and decided he would work with them. Well, it didn't take but about 5 years or so, and we realized that the big person, the big company in this market was not Motorola, but it was Nokia. And so once again, that global nature got us to pick up the largest company, rather the largest company of the next generation, rather than the largest company of the present generation. Change the world. This is always a fun one to talk about because, once again, we spend our lives creating new technology, and sometimes we forget to think about how we can change the world with the technology we have. The best example I have of that is a lot of years ago, I happened to be in the Baltimore area with a colleague of mine, Doug Razor, looking for new business opportunities. And it just so happened I'd received a piece of information from one of our VPs that there was this work going on at Johns Hopkins University to give sight back to the blind. And so we went to talk to them and to see what they were up to. What we found is they were as excited as they could be that TI was coming to talk to them, because that's the technology they needed to give sight back to the blind. We were as excited as we could be to go visit with some leading edge medical doctors who were going to change the world. Now, since then, they have moved from Johns Hopkins to the University of Southern California. We as a company have worked with them that whole time. And when I say worked with them, it was kind of a strange relationship. I began most of the conversations I had with their technologists as follows. There aren't enough blind people in the world for us to make a market out of this. And that sounds tongue-in-cheek, but that's just the reality of our business. We need large markets to succeed well. But I said, this is so important. What we will do is we will provide you any and every technology you need to become successful. If you need an expert that TI happens to house, I will introduce you to that expert. And I am certain when I ask them if they want to help the blind see again, they will be more than happy to work with you. And so we've spent this 10 or so years with this relationship of very little financial help from us to them, but a whole lot of just working together to change the world. Now, what they have available to the market now is the ability to give people with retinitis pigmentosus and macular degeneration the ability to see again. If you're familiar with those diseases, they are diseases that adults get, and as they get older, go blind with those diseases. So this is a wonderful capability to give back to the blind. I think one of the biggest irritations they had on the media was in England, the BBC shot a sequence of one of their recipients of the technology shooting baskets and actually being able to make baskets in basketball. And they said, we don't like that because that's a, what do you call it, a not a good test. We didn't put all of the understanding behind it to make sure that it was a good test to prove the technology worked. And I thought it was the best test in the world. It was somebody actually using it for something valuable. So that was a great joy to begin to work with them to figure out how do we help the blind see? How do we get to a position where we can change the world, not only for today, but in the future? The last one I want to really talk about is I think one of the most important ones we have at Texas Instruments, and that is, with all of this, it is vital that we maintain integrity. I have been at TI for 39 years, and by the way, today is my 39th anniversary, because of integrity. I have not been required or told or even asked to lie, to cheat, to do anything illegal for the good of TI. We have always been a company with integrity. It is so important when I work with small startup companies and I tell them, you understand that even with a non-disclosure agreement, it's going to take more than that to protect your technology. Because for us, it's just expensive. For you, it could be fatal. And so I have always spoken to them and said, I will guarantee you that my integrity is such that all we need is a handshake. We will go through all the paperwork. We will make sure that everything legally is protected. But I want to assure you, integrity will be in place, and all we will need is a handshake and an agreement, and we will go forward. That is the pleasure I've had at TI. So I've been able to do many things freely that other people look at me and say, well, you can do that because of the position you have. And I've always said, I have the position because I've done this all my career. But I have been allowed to do that. But I've always been allowed to do that with the understanding that it would be done with integrity, with honesty, and that we would rather walk away from a customer or an opportunity than to violate that rule. So I hope you've heard that, because I want to make sure, if you remember anything I've said, it is this business, as cutthroat as it may appear, is still a personal business. We do this based on people we know, we trust, and they trust us.